Hey folks, welcome back. My name is Cyrus Davis, and today I have another deck profile for you in the Prismatic Evolutions format, and this time it will be featuring Ancient Box. Ancient Box has been definitely on the dip in popularity. This format, even last format, I mean basically since it came out, I think it has been fluctuatingly popular, but it definitely feels like it is close to an all-time low right now. However, I think the deck is actually fairly well positioned right now. It has good matchups into Miraidon and Gouging Fire, which were the finalist decks at Merida Regionals that just passed. And the Dragapult and Gardevoir matchups are both quite close. I think that Gardevoir is definitely favored into Ancient Box, but I think the Dragapult matchup is very close. You also have a decent time against most of the other decks in the format. You have a great time against Archaludon, Raging Bolt, some other, any other like fringe decks that are not as, maybe in that big three category. So Ancient Box is definitely in a decent place to, be a fun single prize deck that you can do well with, whether at locals or at major events right now. It still can be a little bit on the inconsistent side, which is most people's problem with the deck historically. However, we play some very interesting options that are pretty original in the deck, have not really been seen a lot before. These aren't all, strictly from my ideas, mostly from lists that I have seen recently, and then I've tried them out and liked them a lot. So let's just hop right into it and take a look at what Ancient Box has to offer in the Prismatic Evolutions format. So first, of course, we have the 4 Roaring Moon, 70 damage plus 10 more for each Ancient card you have in your discard pile. This is your main attacker. You just want to build up to do big damage in the late game. Enough damage to take some cheeky, easy one-prize knockouts early game or set up to two-shot things. So pretty efficient attacker in the early game, and then, of course, we can build up to be one-shotting most Pokemon in the format by the end of the game. Then we have 4 Flutter Mane. This has a 1 retreat Pokemon, ancient Pokemon that we can put in the discard pile. Doesn't hurt too much to start it because it only has the 1 retreat, and we can just Sada onto it to give it the energy to move it to the bench. It's also not too bad of a starter. The Midnight Fluttering ability, of course, can have some use to be a little bit disruptive to our opponent, or if we just barely are short of a knockout with Vengeance Fletchling, maybe 10 or 20 damage, then we can potentially even set up to pick up that knockout later with Hex Whirl doing 90 to the active and 20 damage to one of our opponent's bench Pokemon. We do play 1 Great Tusk, just another decent ancient Pokemon option. Allows us to mill the top 4 cards of our opponent's deck if we have played an Ancient Supporter that turn. So just a nice, cute way to potentially deck our opponent out if they get 2-4 cards or lower left in deck. A nice, easy way to put a little bit more pressure on your opponent. They might not be able to go for certain options late game because they have to play around this Great Tusk, or they might, not play around it. They might just not be able to play around it, and we can go ahead and land collapse for game. We have 1 Roaring Moon EX. So this is just a nice, easy way to take one-shots, especially earlier in the game or during the mid-game when we haven't quite reached those numbers yet. It can be quite annoying for some things to knock out, like Archaludon EX. This is a good way to one-shot that in the mid-game, and the 230 HP puts it just out of range of getting knocked out by Archaludon's Metal Defender. We have a couple of different ways to get this into play quickly. We have Dark Patches, and we have a Thorton that we'll look at later. We also, of course, can still power it up Professor Sada's Vitality. And of course, as long as we're taking 2 prize cards with this, even if we're giving up 2 prize cards in return, not too big of a deal because we get the first 2 prize hit. It's still just a nice way to efficiently trade when we can't hit the numbers that we want on Vengeance Fletchling at a key time. Next, of course, we have Radiant Greninja, very key to the deck. We want energy and discard pile for Sada's Vitality. We want that extra draw power. So we are playing Radiant Greninja and using that most turns. And then 1 Fezandipiti EX, just for a little bit of extra draw power. If we don't find what we need and have like a Nest Ball in hand, we can go for Fezandipiti. We don't love having 2 prize Pokemon in play with this deck because we are usually trying to win the prize trade by attacking with 1 prizers for knockouts on 2 prize Pokemon, while our opponent has to return knockout with their 2 prize Pokemon. However, the Fezandipiti, there's a lot of situations when you don't have Fezandipiti in your deck where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to lose this game anyway, so I didn't find what I needed, and I'd rather just take the risk of putting a 2-prize Pokemon in play and have that chance to draw a few cards. We also have the Thorton in the deck, so we have a way to get the Fezandipiti EX out of play as well, making it a little bit less of a liability. And then we have a 1 of Munkidori. This Adrenabrain helps a lot against Dragapult in particular. We can move their Phantom Dive damage back onto them with Adrenabrain. Also, Gardevoir can sometimes be putting some bench damage on us. There are some other decks that will occasionally hit us for a little bit of damage. Even if we get like Hammer in by a Duraludon in the Archaludon deck, we can move that damage away. So it just gives us a little bit of extra damage to push with, especially in the Dragapult matchup. It can be really hard to hit 320 damage in the late game. So pushing their Phantom Dive damage back onto them to get us up to 320 damage for a knockout, it is very, very important in that matchup. And then we have 1 Pecharunt EX just to make sure that we can continuously switch our Roaring Moon into the active. This does give us a free win into Snorlax most of the time. And it just, in a pinch, there's a lot of situations where maybe you could only get 1 Roaring Moon down the previous turn, and you can use this Pecharunt to get it into the active. It also makes the Roaring Moon EX a lot easier to use if we want to just attach Sada and Dark Patch onto that, and then Pecharunt EX it into the active to take our last knockout to win the game. Or if we need to discard all of our other Roaring Moons except the one that we're attacking with in order to take a knockout, but we're not winning the game that turn, then we can do that safely, and then they knock out our last Roaring Moon, and then we get one back and use Subjugating Chains to move that one active, since that way we don't have to retreat back into it. So a lot of use of Pecharunt EX. Also really helps if you do start one of these, but when you don't really want to. Sometimes Roaring Moon EX can be not a great starter, or you can open the Great Tusk and not really want to. The Greninja you can't Sada to, or and same with the Munkidori if you want to retreat them. So yeah, there's a lot of decent uses for Pecharunt EX. Just gets you out of a lot of sticky situations. Again, don't really love putting a 2-riser in play, but the situations where you use Pecharunt EX make it pretty invaluable. They are typically in games that you wouldn't win without having that switching option. So, and then in games when you don't need it, you can just choose not to mention it. Supporters, of course, we have 4 Professor Sada's Vitality. We want to be using these every turn that we can, pretty much. You know, there are definitely some turns where we're going for Explorer's Guidance or something like that instead, but definitely need to have the max copies of Professor Sada's Vitality, especially because we can end up discarding some with Pokestops. And then for Explorer's Guidance as well, lets us get more ancient cards in the discard pile. Also just lets us draw more cards. Honestly, in general, any trainer card that is an ancient card, we're pretty much putting them in this deck no matter what, just because it's an ancient card that we can get into our discard pile without having to risk opening it like the Pokemon. You know, there are some ancient Pokemon that we won't include because they aren't worth it if we start them and we want the deck space for other stuff, but trainer cards are pretty easy to just throw in the deck. There's no risk of opening them instead of the Roaring Moon. And we just want to, you know, play as many as we can. Explorer's Guidance, really, really strong draw card. Can, of course, a combination with PokéStop give you some tricky discard decisions, but as long as you use this card wisely, and you know some of the decisions can be difficult. As long as you make the right ones, you should have enough resources to close the game most of the time. And we have a single copy of Boss's Orders, just to make sure that we have that gusling option. We are not playing Prime Catcher for the Ace spec, as some lists have, so we need to have that 1 Boss's Orders. We can always Pal Pad it back in. Most of the time we're able to counter Catcher, but especially in the late game, there will be some situations where we need to boss for our knockouts. It's also nice to have a Gust that is Pokégear searchable, unlike the counter Catchers. Then we do have that 1 copy of Thorton I talked about, so this is really nice to get our 2 price put 1 out of play if we start them or need to use them, but it also makes the Roaring Moon EX way easier to set up because we can Sada onto a Roaring Moon, a baby Roaring Moon, and then on a future turn just Thorton it. Even if our opponent, let's say we attack with a Roaring Moon and then they go for a knockout on our Greninja, which happens quite a bit if they go for counter catcher, knockout our Greninja and Iono us, then we'll already have a Roaring Moon with 2 energy on it. We can just attach 1 more time to it and Thorton it into the Roaring Moon EX. Even if we just set up 2 Roaring Moons, basically it just allows us to preemptively set up enough energy onto something that we can Thornton into Roaring Moon EX without having to worry about the potential for our opponent to boss it and take 2 prize cards on it before it can attack. This is also a neat way to get Munkidori out, since we otherwise have to use a manual attachment to get that powered up. This way we can Dark Patch or Sada to something and then Thornton it into Munkidori. Also, if we open any ancient Pokemon that isn't Roaring Moon, like Flutter Mane or Great Tusk, this would be a good way to get another ancient Pokemon into the discard pile, get Great Tusk out of the active if we open it with its hefty 3 retreat cost, and we don't want to bench Pecharunt EX, so a lot of uses for Thornton in this list. 4 copies of Nest Ball. just maxing out, we want to find Greninja and Roaring Moons as quickly as possible. 4 copies of Earthen Vessel, same thing. We wanted to be just finding energy every single turn. We pretty much need to attach an energy every single turn, so we don't want to be missing attachments ever, and we want to have lots of energy to use for concealed cards. Also, another way to get ancient cards in the discard pile, and of course, it's an ancient card itself. 3 Night Stretcher, just lots of ways to get Pokemon back. Using more Night Stretchers just has so much versatility because we can use it to get an energy for concealed cards, or we can get a Roaring Moon back. Or we can just get, an energy to attach for turn. So the 3 major options for the card that make it really, really invaluable. Having that flexibility also allows us to put more ancient Pokemon into the discard pile without having to worry about if we're going to be able to sustain our attackers later in the game. We can put them in the discard pile to make sure that we can hit the numbers for knockouts when we need to, and then Night Stretcher them back later. 2 copies of Ultra Ball. Of course, basically functionally the same as Nest Ball as far as its search options go. But at least we can grab Pokemon to put in the hand that we also want to discard. So if we want to grab something like a Great Tusk and then Earthen Vessel it away to get more ancient Pokemon into our discard pile. Or we can use this to get the Pokemon that we want to Thorton into play and discard that. We can also just use Ultra Ball to discard other cards, so that in that way it does have a little bit of value over Nest Ball, since we do want to get lots of ancient cards from our hand into the discard pile, or help us get our Dark Energy into the discard pile. Couple of copies of Ultra Ball is pretty staple. 2 copies of Counter Catcher. We're usually starting the game behind, especially if we're playing against decks that don't play a lot of single price Pokemon. We'll usually be behind at some point in the game, and then once we're into the late game and our opponent's taking a few prize cards and we've gotten a ton of ancient cards in the discard pile and are just one-shotting stuff every turn, then we can start using our Counter Catchers and catch up really quick. 2 copies of Dark Patch. This helps with getting Roaring Moon EX set up. It also helps us get Munkidori set up. Of course, we can't Dark Patch to a Munkidori, but we can save an attachment for turn. When otherwise we would need to attach for turn to a Roaring Moon, we can Dark Patch to it instead, and then use our manual attachment to set up the Munkidori. So important to have these Dark Patches. Also really helps get that Roaring Moon EX set up to attack. Also gives us the option to set up a Fezandipiti EX to attack if we want to go ahead and do an 80 damage snipe for our last prize card. Maybe we only have 1 prize card left, and we can just sort of take that easy knockout on something like I mentioned, Curlia. So Dark Patch is a really nice option for that as well. Just sort of helps with the deck's consistency, saves you on some manual attachments, while also giving us some flexibility and ways to power up other attackers. 2 copies of Pokégear. I'd love to play more. It's very important to use supporters in this deck, but honestly, this deck, with the 2 Dark Patch, you're not as reliant on Sada as past lists. You don't necessarily need to Sada every single turn. You're typically happy to play any of your supporter cards most turns. So because of that, you don't need to find the specific supporter at the right times as often, which means 2 Pokégears usually more than enough. Like I said, if we had room, I'd love this probably be my next choice, to add like a 3rd or 4th copy of Pokégear, but I think that the other cards in the list are just more important. We are playing 1 Pal Pad, especially with PokéStop and Explorer's Guidance in the deck. We want to make sure that we don't lose our supporters when we need them. We can also use Pal Pad late game. We used to get our deck to almost 0, if not 2-0. So we can use Pal Pad to make sure that we don't deck out and make sure that if we get Iono'd, we draw into exactly what we need. Then we play 1 Spirit Energy Retrieval. We go through a lot of energy as our Roaring Moons are attacking for 2 and then getting knocked out pretty easily. So being able to get 4 back, get some more concealed cards off, get another attachment for turn, as well as being able to just get more cards from our hand into the discard pile to boost our ancient count. And then the one of Super Rod, just having that extra bit of ways to recover a couple of Roaring Moons and a couple of energy. Just basically I'd say 2 Night Stretcher, 1 Spirit Energy Retrieval, 1 Super Rod is like the minimum for recovery, and then the 3rd Night Stretcher is really nice just because it's an extra consistency card. However, I think that generally this is just enough of recovery to make sure that you're sustained in every game that you play. You definitely want to have access to a Superior at some point in most games, a Super Rod at some point in most games, and something really nice about this deck as opposed to a lot of other decks is that because you almost always draw through your entire deck, you'll almost always be able to use every single card in your deck if you need to. That's why when I play Ancient and build my list, I like to go with the principle that I want almost all of the cards in my deck to be useful in every single game, because I'm going to get to see every single card in my deck almost every single game. So there's a couple of cards that are text for specific matchups, like the Munkidori, for example. However, for the most part, I like to play cards like the Superior and Super Rod, where I may only play one, but I'll just get to find it almost every game as long as it's not in my like my last couple of prize cards. Then for the ace spec, we're playing Brilliant Blender. I know there's a lot of discussion around which ace spec you should be playing in here, but simply put, this is just the best way to get more ancient cards in your discard pile. Is the most consistent way. Secret Box is probably the second most popular ace spec, but the fact that Secret Box is so reliant on having 3 cards in your hand you want to discard and doesn't do as much as far as just getting ancient cards into your discard pile quickly. Brilliant Blender, to me, is absolutely the best ace spec. It's super fast, super consistent, super aggressive. You're always happy to see it, and it thins your deck for future turns by getting out 5 cards that you don't really want. It's also really nice if you draw it early game. You can even get a couple of Dark Energy in the discard pile to activate your Professor Saw's Vitality, or even get like a Roaring Moon in the discard pile just to Night Stretcher it back, which is actually a play you make a surprising amount of the time if you find the Brilliant Blender early game. Next, we have Stadiums, Tools, and Energy. 2 copies of PokéStop. Not playing the full 3 anymore. Badoo is definitely around, so we don't want to be as much digging through our deck for items. But we still want a couple of copies of PokéStop to help us get our ancient cards in the discard pile, help us find our items. This is still a very item-heavy deck, and a deck that likes to draw lots of cards. Like with the Pokégears, this is a card that, like, although I could play one more of probably, there are just other consistency cards that are more important. Like a third Night Stretcher usually is going to do more for you over the course of a game than a third Pokégear or a third PokéStop. For Ancient Booster Capsule, just another trainer ancient card to get in the discard pile. The plus 60 HP can definitely, put you out of range of things in certain matchups, especially like a Flutter Mane, keeping it out of range of a Ampy Very Much from Iron Hands EX. That can be really key. So there's definitely some stuff that Ancient Booster Energy Capsule does really well. It can help keep Roaring Moons out of range of Trifrost or Phantom Dive knockouts after a couple of multiple turns of damage spread onto your Pokemon. So use these wisely, but most of the time you're happy to just get these in the discard pile. And then we're playing 7 copies of Dark Energy. This is pretty much the standard. This has been the standard for a while. It's just the perfect number, especially with 4 Vessel. Gives you 11 energy outs turn 1, which is usually more than enough. And as enough as 7 energy is enough to set up 3 Roaring Moon, and then even if you have 1 prize, which is also really important, exactly enough energy to put 3 Roaring Moon into play with 2 energy each on them, and then still have an energy to retreat if your opponent tries to like boss Radiant Greninja to stall you or something like that. Always important to make sure you know exactly how many energy you have in your prize cards right from the get-go. That's one of the most important things to prize check as this deck. But 7 is almost always going to be enough, especially with all the recovery cards that we have. Just gives us enough outs to find it turn 1. Next, we'll move on to the matchups. So, Miraidon, favorable matchup. If you open Flutter Mane and then have to bench Radiant Greninja to set up, things can be a little bit trickier because they can amp for 4 prize cards. However, generally speaking, like you can, if long as you don't open Flutter Mane, you're gonna be in pretty good shape. Even if you do open Flutter Mane, you can get like an Ancient Booster Capsule onto it. As long as they don't take too many prize cards before you start attacking for big damage, you'll be able to eventually hit the numbers and just take 6 prizes in 3 turns. You can also, just pretty effectively just 2-shot them with the Roaring Moons and be content with that early game as well. And they do play quite a few Dark Week Pokemon, so if they need to bench Latias EX or Mew EX or even the non-Dark Week Squawkabilly EX, those are pretty easy Pokemon, even in the early to mid-game, to be able to one-shot with Roaring Moon. And, of course, they would try to avoid benching those if they can. However, sometimes they just have to in order to make sure that they can attack and don't fall behind. Raging Bolt EX, a similarly favorable matchup, even more favorable because we don't have to worry about the threat of Iron Hands. They do have Bravery Charm, so the 290 HP can be a little bit harder to hit later in the game, but it's pretty easy by the very end of the game to eventually reach that. As long as they don't take 4 prize cards before you take any, you will almost always win this matchup. You can just take 6 prize cards 3 turns in a row. They only have 1 Iono to disrupt you, and it really shouldn't do that much as long as you have something like a Radiant Greninja into play. Maybe find 1 supporter card. You can thin your deck pretty well by the end of the game here, so usually your deck is just full of draw cards by the time you are getting Iono to a low hand size. Just the fact that they cannot really play around benching a bunch of 2 prize Pokemon, and you will just be able to win the prize trade by knocking out 2-prize Pokemon with single-prize Pokemon. Regidrago V-Star, similar lead to Raging Bolt, where they are only attacking with 2 prizers most of the game. They do have the Radiant Charizard option, and they can try to slow you down early with Badoo. However, by the mid to late game, you should be able to build up to enough damage where you can one-shot Regidrago V-Star. Goodra can be a little bit of a problem, but then they aren't threatening to take multi-prize turns with Phantom Dive and Trifrost, so they have to sort of pick a lane there. They can either, Phantom Dive to threaten Trifrost attacks, wiping your board, or they can Goodra to make it more difficult for you to knock out the Regidrago V-Star. If they Phantom Dive and Trifrost, you might just be able to... what you should ideally try to do is not bench more than 2 Roaring Moon at a time. That way, every time they knock one out, you just bench a new one. That way, you're never in range of getting all of your Pokemon, of them taking 3 prize cards with Trifrost. And then, that way, if they are going for that angle, you can always just find Ancient Booster Capsules or another Roaring Moon to keep yourself out of range. And if they go for the Goodra angle, then they could always get punished by you just finding Boss or Thorton, or not Thornton, Boss or Counter Catcher, every time that they take a knockout with Rolling Iron. And you can actually still use the Roaring Moon EX in this matchup for your last 2 prize cards if they are trying to prevent that last knockout with Rolling Iron. Cirilla GX, another matchup where Badoo could slow you down a little bit early game, but this is very similar to the Regidrago matchup, except they have no really... they don't have Rolling Iron, they don't have Phantom Dive, they don't have Trifrost, so otherwise they are trying to do all the same things. They have the same amount of HP, but they just don't have anywhere near the number of options against you that Regidrago does. They also don't play as much hand disruption as Regidrago does, so this is even more favorable matchup. I'd say this is more on par with Raging Bolt for how favorable it is for you. You can pretty easily just take 2 prize cards 3 times and win the game. Most of these matchups... are so favored because your opponent has to be attacking with 2 prize Pokemon, and as long as they don't take too much of a prize lead, usually even if they take a 3 prize lead, if they go down to 3 prize cards, and then you take a 2 prize knockout, you go down to 4, then they go down to 2, then you go down to 2 when you take a 2 prize knockout, and then they go down to 1, and then you go down to 0. So as long as they don't take 4 prize cards before you take any, you will be in good shape. Now, Cloth is another pretty favorable matchup for the same reason. They play lots of 2-prize Pokemon. They're very 2-prize Pokemon reliant. They do have more 1-prizers that they can try to attack you with, but they really don't have enough 1-prizers to sustain a game without relying on some of the abilities of their 2-prize Pokemon. So eventually, you'll be able to catch up, even if they take the prize lead. Usually, if they're taking your prize lead with the Cloth, making sure that they're attacking with single prizes early on, you'll just be able to pretty easily knock out Cloth even early game. So you'll just be trading 1 for 1 at that point, and eventually, as long as you knock out 1 2-prize Pokemon, you will take that prize lead back in the late game. Next, we have Snorlax. So this is just a matchup where they don't really have a lot of options. You can just keep using Pecharunt EX to bring up your Roaring Moon, and just taking knockouts with it every single turn. The only thing that they can really do to try to play around that is Klefki and try to trap your Pecharunt EX in the active spot, or another Pokemon with a single retreat. But that is just, you play enough energy that you should just be able to easily 1 retreat cost out of there back into your Roaring Moon enough times to take all of your prize cards. Next, we have Gouching Fire. Similarly to Raging Bolt and Miraidon in the way that this matchup's played, they do have a lot more versatile attacking options. However, none of them really do that much against Ancient Box. They are still ultimately going to have to knock you out with their 2 prize Pokemon, and you will be able to return knockout eventually with your single prize Pokemon, taking 1-shots by the mid to late game. Then we have your even matchup, so the Dragapult Dusknoir matchup. Now, this matchup has been worse in the past. The Munkidori helps a lot. Helps you keep your Pokemon alive and reach those Dragapult EX 1-shot numbers very late in the game. However, they still have, they can still board wipe you with Dusknoirs plus Phantom Dive if you don't have a strong enough setup. And if you don't get the Munkidori set up, they can still set up multi-prize turns with Phantom Dive even without the Dusknoir. So it is fairly even. If you get a strong enough start, you should be fine. You should just be cruising through the game, especially if they have to bench something like a Lumineon or a Rotom or a Fezandipiti. You can take an easy 2 prize cards on that. But something that can happen as well in the current format is that they can Badoo you for a while, and you just sort of brick in under Badoo until they get like a bunch of Dusknoirs out, Phantom Dive, and just sort of knock out like 3 Pokemon at once, and you are not going to have the board state to respond to a Dragapult at that point. So very much depends on how strong your early game is. A lot of games, they will just sort of overrun you, especially with Itchy Pollen. But when games where you have a strong setup, this will be, a fine time, especially with the Munkidori, to push that Phantom Dive or Itchy Pollen damage back on them. A lot of people might disagree with this being an even matchup. They might think it's more Dragapult favored, but there's a reason that Ancient Box was able to come second at the Osaka event, 5,000 player event in Japan, while Dragapult was the most popular deck in the format there. Next, we have Archaludon EX. Now, this is similar to a lot of the matchups that we have in the favorable tier, in the sense that they're attacking with 2 prize Pokemon, and they're, we're able to eventually one-shot them with 1 prize Pokemon. However, that 300 HP is a lot harder to hit, and they don't have to bench a lot of liabilities like Fezandipiti and Squawkabilly. Things like even Regidrago, V-Star, and Ceruledge, which have almost 300 HP. Still have to bench things like Teal Mask, Palkia, Squawkabilly, Fezandipiti, usually in order to set up or maintain their draws throughout the game. However, Archaludon EX is usually content to just only have Archaludon EX as a 2-prize Pokemon in play. So we can't take those easy 2-prize knockouts in the mid-game. We have to get to 300, and I cannot overstate how 300 is significantly more difficult to get to than 280 or 270. This is a much, much harder number to hit, and if we don't knock it out, they have multiple Turos, they have Scoop Cyclone, so they can heal, so we can't effectively two-shot these either, which is something that we can do in the early to mid-game against decks like Ceruledge, Regidrago, and Raging Bolt. So there's a lot of problems in that sense in the Archaludon EX matchup. Generally, you're going to try to take some 1-prize knockouts early on. If they have to play something like a Lumineon or a Squawkabilly or a Fezandipiti, you can take a nice easy 2-prize cards on that, and that's why the matchup sort of is even. Also, if they hammer in you, you can move that damage with Munkidori to get a knockout, and we do have the Roaring Moon EX, of course, still to take a one-shot knockout in the mid-game if we're able to pull that off. And like I was mentioning when we talked about Roaring Moon EX, the Metal Defender will not be able to take a return knockout. The Dialga can also be a huge problem, though, because they can go ahead and use Star Chronos and knock out Ionous and then knock out 2 Roaring Moon before, without us even getting to take a turn in between. So there's a lot of options that they have. They have a lot of healing, a lot of disruption. They have the 2-prize turn option with Star Chronos, and they don't have to bench a lot of liabilities, but a lot can go wrong for them. We can take a few prizes early if we get a strong enough setup. We have the Munkidori. We can get the Roaring Moon EX out and be taking one-shots with that. So there's a lot that can go wrong for them, but there's a lot that can go right for us. Next, we have our unfavorable matchups, starting with Gardevoir EX. This may seem like a decent matchup in theory. We have the Dark type weakness. We can just go ahead and one-shot their Gardevoir EX. However, they just attack with Screamtail usually in this matchup. If they play Badoo, that can actually be really annoying as well to slow us down early. But generally speaking, their game plan is just to keep using things like Counter Catcher to bring up our Radiant Greninja if we have to bench it, or any other Pokemon that are difficult for us to get out of the active spot, and then use Roaring Screen on them. Of course, we could get maybe the Pecharunt EX out, but then that's an easy 2-prize card for them to take, which they can still do with Roaring Scream. They can bring up the Greninja, Bravery Charm, or Hero's Cape, Screamtail, and then hit for 200 on our Pecharunt EX for 2 prizes, while putting something active that we cannot easily move to the bench. And then, of course, they're hitting us with a slew of their, 3 to 4 copies of Iono every single game. And they can even attack with Guardy early on with the Hero's Cape if they play that, and it's much, much more difficult for us to one-shot at that point, because we need to already, in the early game be doing up to 200 damage, which is doable, but, significantly harder. It gives them another option with the Hero's Cape. Another thing they can do is when they're attacking with Screamtail, or even if they're taking a knockout on our active with something like Drifloon, they can just Turo their Gardevoir EX out of play, after they power up their attacker with Psychic Embrace, and that way we can't even go Counter Catcher or Boss to take a nice easy 2-prize knockout on it. They're definitely, especially if you get a few prizes early, maybe they have a slower start and you have a strong start. This is a winnable matchup. It is not an auto loss by any means, but I do think that if the Guardy player knows what they're doing and they've played the matchup before, they have a lot of experience into it, that it is very tough. Next, we have Lugia V-Star. Another matchup that might seem okay in theory, they have plenty of 2-price Pokemon, and if they have to bench, a couple of Lumineon, maybe they open something like an Iron Hands that they really don't want to, things can go into our favor, but the Iron Hands being able to take 2 prize turns with a Legacy Energy, making it only a 1-prizer, really, really frustrating for us. If they're playing Genshin, they can, trade 1-for-1 with us. If they don't need to use Lumineon to set up, they really don't have that many 2-prize Pokemon in play. They can also Thorton Lumineon out of play into a single prize Pokemon. And it's pretty difficult for us to knock out Lugia V-Star until the very end of the game, so we can take our last 2 prize cards on that, but if they use attack with the Lugia early on, we sort of waste attacks on it. Especially if they end up just putting the Legacy Energy on that. Really, the Legacy Energy denying us 1 prize at any point in the game is always going to be really frustrating for us. But especially if we have a slow start, which we often do, our favorable matchups are so favorable, because even if we have a slow start, our opponent can take a 3-prize lead, and it won't matter. We can still win the prize race eventually in the late game. However, against something like Lugia, same with Gardevoir, Dragapult, Articuno, the reason all these decks are worse is not because we can't do that, but it's because they can rush us down a lot quicker. They can throw efficient single prizers at us. It's a lot harder for us to keep up the prize race, and they can a lot more consistently just take too much of a lead in the early game for us to catch up. Next, we have Charizard EX. Similar to some of our other matchups, they just have a lot of disruption. It's really, really hard to hit 330, especially with its list, so we're really reliant on Roaring Moon EX to take our last knockout. We definitely can win it by, targeting down. Maybe they have to measure Rotom or Lumineon. Maybe we get a few prize cards early. We can counter catcher the Pidgeot at some point for a 280 knockout. But it's really, really hard to get to 330 damage. And it's, especially if we're getting unfair stamped or Iono to 1 or 2 near the end of the game. They can also, if they're playing Lost Vacuum away our Ancient Booster Capsule. That's one less card that we'll have in the Lost Zone. And they can Turo their Charizard if we try to 2-shot it. Charizard has always been one of Ancient Box's worst matchups and will continue to be. There's nothing about current lists that really make it any better for us. In fact, the Dusknoir even makes it worse because they can use Dusknoir and Greninja on the same time they Iono us, and then Ionos take a prize, Iono us to a lower hand size, and remove our Greninja from play while we, have a low hand size and would really like to be using concealed cards. Lastly, Dragapult Charizard. If Dragapult's an even matchup and Charizard's a bad matchup, you can imagine that Dragapult with Charizard is also going to be a bad matchup. The one thing that's really annoying about this matchup is they are not very reliant on 2-prize Pokemon at all. They might have Dimensional Lumineon early, but they usually play Collapse Stadium or Turo, so they can try to remove it from play before we can even knock it out. And if they don't use Lumineon to set up, we're going to have to go through multiple Dragapults or multiple Charizards, and that's just really, really tough to do. It's hard enough already when we have to take our last 2 prize cards on Pokemon with more than 300 HP, like Charizard or Dragapult. But when we have to knock out more than one over the course of the game, and they can heal it with Turos, maybe more than 1 Turo, who knows? The list can sort of be all over the place. There are definitely lists with 2 Turo, maybe a Turo and a Pal Pad. So the matchup just gets really out of hand really quickly. It's really tough for you to keep up. I think if you can get like a decent Roaring Moon EX knockout on a Charizard and they don't have another Charizard respond, so they have to attack into it with Dragapult, then maybe you can try to, Roaring Moon a second time in a row. But even then, they can just sort of counter catcher around it. They can boss. They can Iono you to low hand sizes. This is possibly your worst matchup, honestly, Dragapult Charizard. At least they don't have Dusknoir, so they don't have that option, but honestly, Dusknoir, not that important against Ancient Box. If for Dragapult or Charizard, it's these huge 320, 330 HP Pokemon, they're really going to be a problem for you. And, if they're attacking with Charizard, you can't even try to fix those numbers with Munkidori. Old Ancient Box lists used to play Cobalion sometimes, and even then would only go 50-50 into Charizard at best. So, this matchup is just really, really difficult. Definitely not the one that you want to hit. However, luckily Charizard and Dragapult Charizard are not some of the most popular decks right now. They definitely make up a decent amount of the field, combined maybe around just under 10%. However, that's relatively fine when we have so many favorable matchups that are so favorable for us, overwhelmingly favorable for us. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. Obviously taking a bad matchup to Gardevoir doesn't feel great. I think taking a bad matchup to these Charizard decks is fine. Lugia, honestly, taking a bad matchup to that after Miraidon took half of the top 8 spots at Merida is a big part of the reason that I wanted to try exploring Ancient Box again, and that I have been playing it more lately. It's nice that, you know, one of our bad matchups is sort of under the radar. Maybe going to be a little bit less popular for the next couple of events. And even Gardevoir, like, it's definitely still very popular, but the fact that that also has a lot of times has a questionable Miraidon matchup. The fact that it just makes me like, okay, well, if Miraidon is going to be doing really good, then, you know, some of the decks that beat Miraidon more consistently might be doing really good. A lot of these decks in the favorable tier are definitely very well positioned and are pretty popular right now. And then, you know, even matchups when Dragapult and Archuludon isn't bad, right? Like, we can take even matchups if we are more skilled than our opponents and know the matchup better. We might be able to win it a bit more than they can. A lot of players might not have also tested against Ancient Box recently, especially this with, like, Roaring Moon EX, Thorton, and the Munkidori. These are all, like, tech cards that they might not be playing around, or they might not know how to play around effectively. So I think the deck actually has a lot going for it right now. The list feels really consistent. I've really liked it so far, and I hope you like it too. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed and you want to check out any of my other socials or my content, that is all through the link tree in the description below. Have a good one.